The first and most important fact to remember about the government of the United States is that it is the product of a democratic revolution. The foundations of the American political order were laid by a coalition of forces that prevailed through an 8 year long war of independence. This coalition was a fragile one, regularly shaken by the tensions that divided its members. But it was a remarkably durable coalition. The protest movement that grew into the American Revolution began in the mid 1760s, soon after Britain won a long and exhausting world war whose campaigns in this country are called the French and Indian War. This war had two primary effects on the colonies. First, the joint military effort had encouraged the colonies to think of themselves as an interdependent community, whose individual security depended upon the security of all. Second, the weight of British rule increased dramatically. London had gone deep into debt to fund its war effort, and the government concluded that the colonies should pay for their own defense in the form of increased taxation. These taxes cut across class lines, affecting wealthy elites and middling farmers alike. So it was no surprise that a spontaneous mass protest movement arose immediately. Britain responded by sending troops who garrisoned the coastal towns. Years of simmering conflict, punctuated by occasional crises, encouraged the constant development of political ties between the colonies. At one level, elites throughout the colonies found common cause. City merchants and southern plantation lords each wanted to be free to take full advantage of the booming Atlantic economy. The merchants hoped to profit in the emerging capitalist markets that tied Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The planters wanted to dominate the cash crop export market on the backs of enslaved workers. These elites had good reason to favor independence, though it took nearly a dozen years for them to decide to make the final leap. By the early 1770s, the Continental Congress organized by these elites served as a body of representatives speaking for the established interests of all 13 colonies in its conflict with Britain. Arguably, this would not have occurred without the insistent democratic pressure generated from below among the mass of the colonial population. Most of these people were small farmers who owned their land, along with self employed artisans and a small but militant working class in the port towns. Though they did not share the same economic concerns as wealthier Americans, they were deeply committed to the colonial culture of self rule and relative equality, a culture directly challenged by the presence of British troops and royal governors with a mandate to extract taxes from the population. By the time fighting erupted in the spring of 1775, the colonies were poised for drastic action. Militias mobilized up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and in every colony, conventions were elected to debate their political future. Many of these conventions expressed radical democratic sentiments that went well beyond the politics of the elite leadership. This grassroots revolution pushed the Congress to act. In response, it made two monumental decisions. It called on the colonies to write constitutions for themselves and organize themselves as independent states, and it authorized the publication of a general declaration of independence that would announce the colony's break with London. The task of writing the declaration was delegated to Thomas Jefferson, who was charged with drawing up a statement to the world justifying the joint effort by the colonies to break free of the British Empire. Jefferson's text drew heavily upon the liberal political theory of the English philosopher John Locke. Locke's thought was enormously influential in 18th century America, and it was immediately recognizable to any educated contemporary of Jefferson's. But even the vast majority of Americans who had never heard of Locke recognized in the Declaration the same intuitive belief in popular sovereignty that was widely shared in the colonies. By popular sovereignty, I mean the idea that political power, the right to make and enforce laws that apply to all, resides with the people of a country rather than a monarch or an oligarchy. The Americans who made the revolution were the inheritors of political traditions of self rule that had been formed in the period of Britain's own revolutions in the 17th century. This ideal of a self governing community of free men, more or less broadly defined based on wealth, was seated in every one of the colonies. Implicit in Jefferson's argument is the accusation that the British rulers of the American colonies had declared war on their subjects well before fighting broke out in Lexington and Concord. Rather, the outbreak of the rebellion was the last step in the revolutionary process, which had been defined by increasingly arbitrary, erratic, and brutal British rule in the colonies. The idealistic opening of the Declaration is lifted entirely from Locke's thought. The premise is straightforward. Jefferson begins with the supposedly self evident fact that since all people are created with an equal claim to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they also possess the right to order a government they believe is best suited to protecting those claims. The only legitimate kind of government is a government that exists to secure those rights under the authority of the whole people. In fact, this is the central ideological claim of the American Revolution. Only governments based on the authority of the people have a right to rule. Any other government is open to a revolutionary challenge. Hence the list of indictments against King George III, which Jefferson lists as evidence in favor of the gamble of American independence. I want to highlight a couple of them here, both to point out where Jefferson stuck closely to Locke's thinking and where he made some important departures. Jefferson condemns King George in Lockean terms when he accuses George of suspending colonial laws and charters, dispersing their assemblies, and imposing direct royal authority over them. Jefferson was on solid ground here, at least from the perspective of the revolutionaries. From this point of view, since 1763, the royal government had relentlessly ground down colonial autonomy and violated the colonial understanding of their status in the British Empire. Of course, from the loyalist point of view, this might just have been an aggressive government response to unrest and disorder, a kind of law and order campaign designed to crack down on troublemakers. But Jefferson also condemns the king in terms that had particular resonance for the men who organized colonial resistance. Land hungry speculators and planters chafed at British restrictions of movement across the Appalachian Mountains, which were created at the behest of allied native tribes who wished to defend their land from American invasion. For Jefferson and the Continental Congress, this was not just a restriction on the liberties of Americans to settle where they pleased, but a sign that the king sided with native tribes who were locked in perpetual conflict with the colonists. This was the motive behind Jefferson's claim that King George encouraged Indian attacks on frontier settlements, as well as the belief that George was willing to encourage a slave insurrection. Jefferson and his Southern peers lived in deep fear of a slave revolt, a fear that was heightened by the chaos of the Revolution. Hence, independence was necessary to protect the property of both frontier farmer and slave-holding planter alike. The accusations that make up the bulk of the Declaration are a kind of legal argument, a marshalling of evidence meant to demonstrate that King George had forfeited his right to rule the colonies, which by rights should rule themselves. Locke serves Jefferson's purpose by offering a way for the revolutionaries to present themselves as the true upholders of the law. Thus, a legal fiction is created for the benefit of successful rebels. If rebels overthrow the old regime in favor of a new one, this new government is invested with sovereign power by the consent of the people, and so is a legitimate source of law. The continuity of law, then, has never technically been broken, except by the lawless rulers whose excesses provoked revolution in the first place. Once publicly released, the Declaration of Independence accelerated the revolutionary transformation of political life in the colonies. Each former colony, now claiming to be a free state, worked to create a new constitution to reflect this reality. Pennsylvania's revolutionary constitution was a product of this spirit of 1776. Democratic politics had been long established in Pennsylvania, and as the revolution approached, the existing landed elite began to lose power to up and coming lower class militants who pushed for a wholesale renovation of politics. Elections held in the spring of 1776 brought this group to power, and with popular backing, they wrote a constitution decades ahead of its time. In revolutionary Pennsylvania, there would be one legislative chamber to make the laws. These lawmakers would be directly elected by the people, and those same voters would have the final say when it came to approving or disapproving the laws made by the legislature. In every other state, the right of free men to vote was limited by property qualifications. Only in Pennsylvania was voting a right open to all free men regardless of wealth. Instead of a single governor, a 12-man council ran the executive branch. And every few years, a special board of censors would be elected to investigate the conduct of the government and punish any deviations from the Constitution. This government aimed to sideline the landed elites who had typically dominated politics, and they were not willing to step away without a fight. These elites fought the new government at every turn, withholding support and cooperation, and occasionally sabotaging the governing regime. And all of this occurred in the context of the ongoing War of Independence, which at various points saw Philadelphia occupied by the British and at least two attempted mutinies by American soldiers against a Congress too poor to pay them. Ultimately, the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 was scrapped and replaced by a document that conformed to the emerging American governing standard: a legislature with an upper and lower house, a single governor, and a limited pool of voters based on property. This new constitution was passed in 1790, 1 year after the federal constitution was written to impose a new governing order on the United States. As we get ready to study the federal constitution in detail, we should keep in mind that in many ways, this constitution was a counter revolutionary document, one that reined in the development of popular democracy in favor of a more restricted system that protected the interests of economic elites. This tension between democracy and property returns repeatedly in American history. It was present at the beginning, just as it continues today to create fault lines and conflicts in American politics.